In the electromagnetic chaos of a Northern Sahara storm, a grounded pilot was about to defy every military protocol she'd sworn to uphold. What started as monitoring routine communications took a shocking turn when she intercepted a desperate distress signal from her former unit trapped behind enemy lines. Captain Naomi Vega wasn't your typical desk-bound instructor. For 15 years, she had spent her life mastering the deadliest flying conditions imaginable, known for navigating by sound and instinct when all technology failed. When she heard Sergeant Layla Hassan's voice crackling through the static, 8 personnel, multiple wounded, request immediate extraction, she had no idea she was walking into a choice between following orders and following conscience. Vega made a decision that would lead to the theft of a decommissioned Black Hawk and a solo rescue mission through conditions that had grounded every other aircraft on base. What began as a career-ending act of insubordination would become a revolution in military aviation. The Northern Sahara Greenbelt Zone would never be the same after one pilot proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what you're told not to do. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Naomi Vega had been stationed at Forward Operating Base Meridian for 18 months, and most days she felt like a ghost haunting the tactical briefing rooms. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet precision of someone who had learned that competence spoke louder than conversation. Her regulation flight suit hung perfectly pressed, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that somehow made her blend into the background of every briefing room she entered. The other pilots at FOB Meridian had a habit of mistaking her for administrative personnel. Just last week, Lieutenant Morrison had handed her a clipboard and asked her to run this to the ops office, sweetheart. She'd taken the clipboard without comment, delivered it to the appropriate office, and returned to studying weather patterns in the corner of the ready room. It wasn't worth the energy to correct assumptions that wouldn't change minds. What they didn't know was that Naomi's combat background included classified extraction missions in Afghanistan that officially never happened. Missions where she'd learned to navigate by sound, wind patterns, and instinct when all electronic systems failed in hostile territory. Her flight jacket contained more than regulation equipment. Hidden pockets held backup navigation tools, emergency frequency charts, and hand-copied procedures for flying in conditions that would ground most pilots. But she kept these capabilities to herself. Experience had taught her that proving expertise often mattered less than fitting expectations. Better to be underestimated and useful than recognized and reassigned to missions that would separate her from the work she actually cared about. The first real warning sign came during Monday morning's flight operations briefing. Colonel Julian Rourke, the base commander, stood before a room of 30 pilots with the kind of stern expression that meant serious business. Intelligence reports indicate increased hostile activity in Sector 7, he announced, pointing to a red zone on the tactical display. All female pilots are restricted to transport duties within the secure perimeter until further notice. Naomi felt her stomach drop, but she kept her expression neutral. Around her, the male pilots nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Lieutenant Morrison, fresh from flight school with 6 months of desert experience, actually chuckled under his breath. "Good thing," he whispered to his seat partner. "Last thing we need is emotional decision-making in a firefight." After the briefing, Naomi approached Colonel Rourke's aide, Sergeant Davis. "Sir, I'd like to request clarification on the new flight restrictions." Davis barely looked up from his paperwork. "What's to clarify? Colonel's orders are clear. Transport duties only." "With respect, my service record shows." "Your service record shows transport operations, Martinez. That's what you'll continue doing." Naomi stood there for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of being dismissed before she'd even been heard. She could have mentioned her combat extraction experience, her classified missions, her proven ability to fly in conditions that would ground other pilots. Instead, she nodded once and walked away. That evening, she sat in her quarters with topographical maps spread across her desk. While other pilots were playing cards in the recreation tent, Naomi was studying terrain features that others ignored, marking alternative emergency routes with careful precision. Her hand-drawn maps showed canyon passages and natural wind corridors that weren't on standard navigation charts, routes used by indigenous populations for generations before military mapping. She folded the map and tucked it into her flight jacket pocket, next to the emergency frequency charts she'd memorized and the backup compass that had saved her life in Afghanistan. Tomorrow would bring another day of routine supply runs, while the male pilots handled real missions. But Naomi had learned something important during her years of service. Preparation mattered more than recognition. As she turned off her desk lamp, she had no way of knowing that within 48 hours, 8 Marines would be trapped in a ravine, their lives depending on a pilot willing to attempt the impossible. The same colonel who had restricted her to transport duties would soon be begging her to fly a mission that every other pilot had declared suicidal. But tonight, Naomi simply continued her quiet preparation for the emergency she sensed was coming, unaware that she was about to prove that the most dangerous assumptions are the ones we make about people we've never bothered to really see. In the corner of the hangar, beneath a tarp marked decommissioned, sat Ghost Viper, a Black Hawk helicopter that had been written off after multiple system failures. No one else bothered to check on it anymore. But Naomi visited it every evening, running her hands over its modifications, ensuring its systems stayed flight-ready. She'd rebuilt its navigation array herself, upgrading it with analog backups and acoustic sensors that could function when all electronics failed. Ghost Viper, like its secret caretaker, was waiting for the moment when being written off would become an advantage. The electromagnetic pulse hit at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning, washing over the Northern Sahara greenbelt zone like an invisible tidal wave. Naomi woke to the sound of emergency klaxons and the strange silence that comes when every electronic device goes dark simultaneously. Her quarters were pitch black, no digital clock, no base lighting, no hum of air conditioning. Outside, she could hear confused voices and the distant rumble of diesel generators kicking in. She dressed quickly and made her way to the communications center, where chaos reigned. Banks of screens flickered uselessly, their displays showing nothing but static snow. Communications specialist Rodriguez was hunched over an ancient analog radio set, adjusting dials with the precision of a surgeon. "Solar storm," he announced to the gathering crowd of officers. "Biggest one in 15 years. Knocked out GPS, satellite comms, the works. We're running on emergency power and pre-digital backup systems." Colonel Rourke pushed through the crowd, his face grim in the red glow of emergency lighting. "How long until systems come back online?" "Could be hours, could be days, sir. Depends on how long the particle radiation lingers in the magnetosphere." Naomi positioned herself near the analog equipment, her trained ear picking up fragments of transmissions bleeding through the static. Most of it was interference and automated distress beacons, but something else caught her attention, a pattern in the noise that sounded almost like Morse code. She moved closer to Rodriguez's station. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to an unused frequency scanner. Rodriguez looked up, surprised to see her. Most pilots avoided the communication center. "Go ahead, Captain. We need all the ears we can get." Naomi plugged in a pair of headphones and began scanning through frequencies that others had written off as dead static. Her fingers worked the analog dials with practiced precision, isolating signals from interference using techniques she'd learned during classified missions. There, buried beneath layers of electromagnetic noise, was something that made her blood run cold. It was a voice, fractured and desperate, transmitting on an emergency frequency that hadn't been used since Afghanistan. Layla Hassan, Sergeant First Class, serial number. The transmission cut out, swallowed by static. Naomi's hands went still on the controls. Layla Hassan, her former co-pilot. The woman who had stood beside her during the civilian rescue mission that had cost Naomi her flight status. Layla had been transferred to forward reconnaissance after Naomi's court-martial, punishment by association. She boosted the signal, applied filters she'd learned during electronic warfare training. The voice came through clearer this time. "Trapped in canyon, 8 personnel, multiple wounded. Request immediate extraction. GPS coordinates. Static consumed the rest." "Colonel," Naomi called out, loud enough to cut through the chatter, "I'm receiving a distress signal from a recon unit. They're trapped and need extraction." Rourke moved to her station, his expression skeptical. "What's your confidence level on that signal?" "Hi, sir. It's Sergeant Hassan's unit. They're using emergency protocols and—" "Sergeant Hassan?" Rourke's eyes narrowed. "The medic who testified at your hearing?" The room seemed to grow quieter. Naomi felt the weight of history pressing down on her, the same history that had branded her as emotionally compromised and unfit for command decisions. "Yes, sir." She's requesting immediate extraction. Multiple wounded. Lieutenant Torres, the base's communications officer and one of the few people who still treated Naomi with professional respect, stepped forward. I can confirm the signals, sir. The frequency and encryption match our forward recon protocols. Rourke studied the analog displays, his jaw working silently. Around them, other officers waited for his decision. Finally, he shook his head. The storm makes it impossible to verify their location or assess the tactical situation. We can't authorize a rescue mission based on fragmentary communications and zero visibility. Sir, with respect, Naomi began, I can triangulate their position using terrain acoustics and... Captain Vega. Rourke's voice cut like a blade. Your expertise in unauthorized rescue operations is exactly why you're not qualified to assess this situation. We wait for the storm to pass and proper communications to be restored. The dismissal stung, but Naomi held her tongue. She watched as Rourke ordered the communications team to continue monitoring standard frequencies, while ignoring the emergency channel, where Layla's voice continued to call out into the void. Every few minutes the signal would break through. Losing blood, need immediate, and then nothing. Torres caught her eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. He'd heard what she'd heard. More importantly, he believed her. As the morning wore on, Naomi remained at the communication station, officially monitoring routine channels but actually tracking Layla's deteriorating signal. Each transmission was weaker than the last. The unit wasn't just trapped, they were dying. At 1,100 hours, she approached Rourke one final time. Sir, the signal is getting weaker. If we don't act soon... Captain, you are dismissed from this duty station. Report to simulator training. We have rookies who need instruction. Naomi saluted and left, but not before catching Torres's eye one last time. He mouthed a single word, later. That afternoon, while leading Private Kim and 3 other rookies through basic navigation exercises in the flight simulator, Naomi's mind was miles away. She thought about Layla, brilliant, fierce Layla who had never hesitated to speak truth to power. Layla who had risked her own career to defend Naomi during the court-martial. Private Kim noticed her distraction. Captain, are you all right? Naomi looked at the young pilot, barely 22, full of enthusiasm and unbroken faith in the system. Tell me, Kim, if you knew people were dying and you had the skills to save them, but regulations said you couldn't act, what would you do? Kim's brow furrowed. I guess I'd follow regulations, ma'am. Trust the chain of command. Naomi nodded slowly. Once she might have given the same answer. That night, Torres found Naomi in the hangar, standing beside Ghost Viper's shrouded form. The massive helicopter looked like a sleeping giant beneath its tarp, deceptively peaceful in the dim emergency lighting. The signal's almost gone, he said without preamble. Last transmission was 20 minutes ago. Just coordinates and a medical status report. It's bad, Naomi. She pulled back a corner of the tarp, revealing Ghost Viper's sleek nose cone. Her modifications were subtle but significant. Upgraded analog backup systems, enhanced audio sensors for terrain navigation, and fuel capacity increased by 30%. Show me the coordinates. Torres handed her a folded paper with numbers written in his careful handwriting. Canyon system about 60 clicks northeast, right in the middle of the storm zone. He paused. Rourke's made it clear, no rescue mission until communications are fully restored. How long will that be? Could be 12 hours, could be 3 days. Torres watched as she ran her hand along Ghost Viper's hull. By then, it won't matter. Naomi climbed up onto the helicopter's maintenance platform, checking fuel lines and engine components with practiced efficiency. What's the current security protocol for the flight line? Minimal. Most electronic surveillance is down, just roving patrols every 2 hours. Torres's voice carried a warning. Naomi, whatever you're thinking. I'm not thinking anything, she said quietly. I'm remembering. Remember when we used to fly by compass and map, when pilots were expected to navigate by terrain features and wind patterns? Before my time, but I know the stories. She nodded toward the communications building. How long until you could disable the remaining flight line sensors without triggering alarms? Torres was quiet for a long moment. Naomi, you're talking about stealing a military aircraft. That's not just court-martial territory, that's federal prison. I'm talking about saving 8 Marines who are dying while we follow protocols. She turned to face him. and in the red emergency lighting, her expression was resolute. "You don't have to help me, but you know I'm right. Ghost Viper isn't even flight certified. It's been grounded for system failures. It's been grounded for electronic failures. All the problems were in the digital navigation and communications systems." She patted the helicopter's side affectionately. "I've replaced all of that with analog backups and manual controls. She'll fly." Torres shook his head, but she could see his resolve weakening. "The weather alone makes it suicide. No GPS, no radio contact, flying blind through electromagnetic interference. I've done it before. Afghanistan, 2047. Lost all electronics 30 minutes into a combat extraction. Brought 17 people home using nothing but compass heading and terrain bounce. That was different. You had official authorization." Naomi climbed down from the platform and faced him directly. "And how did that official authorization work out for me, Torres? When I saved those civilians in Kandahar, following every regulation except the one that would have let them die, what happened?" He looked away. They both knew the answer. "I need 3 things," she continued. "Flight clearance codes, weather data for the canyon system, and 30 minutes of interrupted access to Ghost Viper." "Jesus, Naomi." Torres ran his hands through his hair. "You're really going to do this?" "Layla Hassan wouldn't hesitate if our positions were reversed. She proved that when she testified for me." Torres pulled out a tablet, one of the few electronic devices still functioning on backup power. "The clearance codes change every 6 hours. Next rotation is at 0400. Weather data shows high winds, 0 visibility, and unstable terrain conditions." He looked up at her. "It's not just dangerous. It's impossible. Good thing impossible is my specialty." They spent the next 2 hours going over technical details. Torres provided her with hand-drawn terrain maps based on the last known GPS coordinates before the storm hit. Naomi showed him her modifications to Ghost Viper, explaining how the analog systems could function when electronics failed. At 0200, Private Kim appeared in the hangar entrance, looking nervous and determined. "Captain Vega, I couldn't sleep." Naomi and Torres froze. Discovery by a rookie pilot could end everything before it began. "I kept thinking about what you asked me earlier," Kim continued. "About following regulations when people are dying." He stepped closer, his young face earnest in the emergency lighting. "I looked up your service record. The real one, not the sanitized version they show us in training." Naomi's heart sank. "Kim, whatever you think you know. I know that you've saved more lives than any pilot on this base. I know that you were grounded for doing what was right, instead of what was convenient." He glanced at Ghost Viper's partially uncovered form. "And I know that someone needs to help those Marines." Torres started to speak, but Kim held up his hand. "I'm not asking to come along. I'm not qualified for that kind of mission." He pulled a set of keys from his pocket. "But I am qualified to make sure the security patrol takes a long route around the motor pool at 0400. And I am qualified to forget that I saw anything unusual in this hangar tonight." Naomi studied the young pilot's face, seeing something of her younger self in his quiet determination. "You understand what you're offering. If this goes wrong, 8 Marines die because we followed regulations instead of our conscience." Kim placed the keys on a nearby workbench. "That's not the kind of pilot I want to be." As Kim disappeared back into the night, Torres shook his head in amazement. "Kid's got spine. Reminds me of someone I used to know." Naomi was already climbing back onto Ghost Viper, beginning her pre-flight checklist. "Help me get the tarp off. We've got work to do." They worked in efficient silence, 2 professionals preparing for a mission that existed in the gray area between heroism and insubordination. As the first pale light of dawn began to show through the hangar's high windows, Ghost Viper sat ready, fuel tanks full, analog instruments calibrated, and rotors cleared for takeoff. "Last chance to change your mind," Torres said as he handed her the flight clearance codes. Naomi strapped on her helmet and fired up the auxiliary power unit. Ghost Viper's engines began their familiar warm-up cycle, the sound echoing through the empty hangar like a promise of redemption. "Lila's counting on me," she said simply. "I won't let her down again." At 0357 hours, Naomi slipped through the pre-dawn darkness toward the flight line, her heart hammering against her ribs with the steady rhythm of a rotor blade. The base was eerily quiet under emergency lighting, most personnel either asleep or manning critical stations in the communications center. Emergency protocols had created the perfect cover for what she was about to do. Ghost Viper sat in the hangar like a sleeping predator, her black hull gleaming dully under the red emergency lights. Naomi had spent the last hour running through every system check twice, ensuring that her analog modifications would hold up under combat conditions. The helicopter's engines were warm, fuel tanks topped off, and her hand-drawn navigation chart secured in the cockpit map case. She pulled on her flight helmet and activated the night vision system, one of the few electronic components she'd kept functional. The world shifted to green-tinted clarity as she approached the aircraft. Every movement felt deliberate, weighted with the knowledge that she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. "Ghost Viper, this is Vega. Beginning final pre-flight." She spoke the words to empty air, a ritual that calmed her nerves. In less than 10 minutes, she would either be airborne and committed to her course, or under arrest for attempted theft of military property. Torres materialized out of the shadows near the hangar entrance, moving with the purposeful stride of someone on official business. "Security patrol just passed. You've got a 12-minute window before they circle back." More than enough. Naomi climbed into the pilot's seat, her hands finding the familiar controls by muscle memory. The analog instruments glowed softly in the cockpit's red lighting: altimeter, compass, artificial horizon, and the custom acoustic navigation display she'd installed herself. "Communications are completely dark for another 6 hours minimum," Torres continued, checking his watch. "Once you lift off, you're on your own until you get back." Understood. She began the startup sequence, each switch activation bringing Ghost Viper closer to life. "Torres, if this goes wrong..." "It won't go wrong. You're the best pilot on this base. Grounded or not." He paused at the hangar door. "Besides, someone needs to tell these officers that following orders isn't the same thing as leadership." The main rotor began its slow rotation, building speed with a deep thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the hangar walls. Naomi felt the familiar surge of connection that came with bringing a helicopter to life, the machine becoming an extension of her will, responsive to the slightest touch. Through her headset, she heard the subtle click of Torres accessing the communications system. A moment later, her radio crackled with the sound of white noise. He was jamming the frequency used by base security, buying her precious additional minutes before anyone could coordinate a response. "Tower, this is Ghost Viper requesting emergency departure clearance," she transmitted on the standard frequency, knowing that the electromagnetic storm would garble any response long enough for her to clear the airspace. She didn't wait for a reply that wouldn't come. Ghost Viper lifted smoothly from the hangar floor, rising through the open doors into the storm-darkened sky. The base fell away beneath her, a cluster of red lights in an ocean of electromagnetic chaos. For the first time in 18 months, Naomi felt truly alive. The radio exploded with confused chatter as base personnel realized what was happening. Through the static, she caught fragments of Colonel Rourke's voice, harsh with authority and disbelief. "Unauthorized departure, immediate return, activate emergency protocols." Naomi switched off the radio and banked northeast toward the canyon system where Layla's signal had originated. Behind her, she could see lights beginning to move on the base as security teams scrambled to respond. By the time they organized a pursuit, she would be deep in the storm zone where their electronic systems would be useless. The electromagnetic interference intensified as she flew deeper into the storm. Her night vision flickered and died, leaving her to navigate by the faint glow of analog instruments and the occasional lightning flash that illuminated the desert landscape below. This was familiar territory, the kind of flying that separated true pilots from technicians who needed computers to stay airborne. 20 minutes out, she encountered the first real challenge. A wall of sand and electromagnetic static rose before her like a living thing, twisting and churning in the storm winds. Visibility dropped to 0. And even her analog compass began spinning erratically, as the storm's magnetic field played havoc with navigation systems. Naomi switched to acoustic navigation, a technique she'd learned during her classified missions in Afghanistan. Ghost Viper's modified sensor array picked up the subtle echoes of rotor noise bouncing off terrain features below. The canyon walls created distinctive acoustic signatures, different from open desert, different from mountain ridges. She flew by sound now, reading the landscape through audio feedback, the way a bat navigates in darkness. The helicopter shuddered as crosswinds caught her rotors, threatening to slam her into invisible canyon walls. Naomi compensated with minute adjustments to collective and cyclic controls, feeling her way through the storm with the delicate touch of a surgeon. Ghost Viper responded like a living thing, her analog systems immune to the electromagnetic chaos that would have grounded any other aircraft. 35 minutes after takeoff, Naomi picked up the first faint signal from Layla's emergency beacon. The transmission was weak and fragmentary, but it was enough to establish a rough bearing. She adjusted course, following the signal deeper into the canyon system where the storm's fury was partially blocked by towering rock walls. Behind her, the base was now fully alert to her theft. Colonel Rourke would be mobilizing every available asset to bring her back, if not to save her from herself, then to prevent a potential international incident if she crashed in hostile territory. But Rourke's pursuit aircraft were all electronic dependent, grounded until the storm passed. By the time they could launch, the mission would be over, one way or another. "Hang on, Layla," Naomi whispered into the storm. "I'm coming." 50 minutes into the flight, Ghost Viper bucked like an angry horse as downdrafts from the canyon walls caught her rotors. Naomi fought the controls, her hands dancing across analog instruments that told her everything except the one thing she needed most, exactly where she was. The electromagnetic storm had turned navigation into a deadly game of acoustic chess, each rotor beat echoing off invisible rock walls that could crush her if she guessed wrong. The acoustic navigation display showed terrain signatures shifting and wavering as wind patterns changed the sound reflections. What had been a clear canyon passage 30 seconds ago was now registering as solid rock. Naomi gritted her teeth and dropped altitude, using a technique that would have terrified her instructors, flying low enough that Ghost Viper's landing gear almost kissed the canyon floor, reading the terrain through rotor wash and acoustic bounce. Lightning illuminated the landscape in stroboscopic flashes, revealing a maze of red sandstone walls carved by millennia of flash floods. For brief instants, she could see the path ahead, a winding corridor barely wide enough for her rotor disc, walls rising like cathedrals on either side. Then darkness would slam down again, leaving her to navigate by sound and instinct. Her fuel gauge showed 60% remaining. Enough for the return trip if she found Layla's unit quickly. If she didn't, well, that was a problem for later. The emergency beacon signal strengthened as she penetrated deeper into the canyon system. Through her headset, she began picking up voice transmissions, fragmentary and desperate. Multiple casualties, need immediate, position compromised. Layla's voice, hoarse with exhaustion and pain. Naomi keyed her microphone, transmitting on the emergency frequency. "Broken Arrow 6, this is Ghost Viper. I have your position and am inbound for extraction. Give me a signal count and casualty report." Static filled her headset for long seconds. Then, "Ghost Viper, Broken Arrow 6. "That you, Naomi?" The relief in Layla's voice was palpable even through the interference. "It's me. What's your status?" 8 personnel, 3 critical wounded, 2 walking wounded, were pinned down in a box canyon about 2 clicks northeast of our last reported position. Enemy contact intermittent but persistent. How's your landing zone? Non-existent. Steep walls, boulder field. Maybe 30 meters of clear space if you don't mind landing on loose rock. Naomi consulted her hand-drawn terrain maps, cross-referencing with the acoustic readings. A box canyon meant limited escape routes for both the trapped Marines and any rescue attempt. Can you mark your position? Negative on flares. Don't want to give the bad guys a target. But I can give you acoustic guidance. You always were crazy enough to land anywhere. 20 minutes later, Naomi found them. The canyon opened into a natural amphitheater carved from red sandstone, walls rising nearly vertical on 3 sides. At the bottom, she could make out the dark shapes of scattered Marines, taking cover behind boulders and fallen rocks. Muzzle flashes winked from positions higher up the canyon walls, enemy forces with the high ground and plenty of ammunition. "Broken Arrow 6, I have visual on your position. Looks like you've got company on the north wall." "Affirm. Squad strength opposition, at least. They've been keeping us pinned since dawn." Naomi circled the canyon at altitude, studying the tactical situation through brief lightning flashes. The only possible landing zone was a narrow strip of relatively flat ground directly in the center of the enemy's kill zone. Any approach would expose Ghost Viper to concentrated fire for at least 30 seconds, an eternity in combat time. Layla, I'm going to need you to create a distraction when I come in. Can your mobile personnel lay down suppressing fire on that north wall? We've got maybe 200 rounds left total, but yeah, we can give you cover. Naomi checked her instruments one final time. Fuel at 55%. Hydraulics nominal. Analog systems functioning perfectly. Ghost Viper was ready for the most dangerous landing of her career. Broken Arrow 6, stand by for approach. When you see my lights, light up that north wall with everything you've got. She rolled Ghost Viper into a diving approach, using the canyon walls to mask her profile until the last possible moment. The helicopter dropped like a stone through the storm-twisted air, rotors screaming as she pulled out of the dive barely 50 feet above the canyon floor. Instantly, the night exploded with gunfire. Tracer rounds streaked past her cockpit as enemy fighters on the canyon rim opened up with automatic weapons. Naomi jinked left and right, using every bit of her combat experience to make Ghost Viper a difficult target while simultaneously lining up for landing. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Marines below opened fire with disciplined bursts, their muzzle flashes directed upward at the enemy positions. It wasn't much cover, but it was enough to keep the enemy gunners from taking careful aim at the incoming helicopter. Ghost Viper's landing lights blazed to life, illuminating the boulder-strewn landing zone in harsh white glare. Naomi saw immediately that there was no good place to put the aircraft down, just loose rock and scattered debris that could destroy her landing gear or flip the helicopter. She had one chance. Instead of landing, Naomi brought Ghost Viper into a pinnacle hover, balancing the aircraft on one landing skid atop a relatively stable boulder while keeping the rest of the helicopter airborne. The technique required absolute precision. Too much weight on the skid and the boulder would shift, sending them crashing into the canyon wall. Too little contact and the helicopter would drift away from the pickup zone. "Move, move, move!" Layla's voice cut through the gunfire. Dark figures sprinted from cover toward the hovering helicopter. Naomi held Ghost Viper steady as hands reached up to drag wounded Marines into the cargo compartment. Bullets sparked off the aircraft's armor plating as enemy fire intensified, the canyon echoing with the sound of automatic weapons and rotor blades. One of the wounded Marines, barely conscious and missing most of his left arm, was lifted bodily into the helicopter by his teammates. Another casualty, hit in the chest and struggling to breathe, was passed up with agonizing care. Each second of the hover felt like an hour, as Naomi fought crosswinds and enemy fire while keeping 30,000 pounds of helicopter balanced on a single point of contact. "Last man coming up," Layla's voice, closer now as she supervised the loading. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked across the canyon, missing Ghost Viper's tail rotor by less than 10 feet before exploding against the far wall in a shower of rock fragments. The concussion wave buffeted the helicopter, threatening to knock it off its precarious perch. "We're loaded. Go, go, go!" Naomi pulled collective and felt Ghost Viper leap away from the boulder, climbing rapidly as more gunfire erupted from the canyon rim. She banked hard left, using the canyon walls for cover as they climbed toward the storm-swept sky above. In the cargo compartment behind her, she could hear Layla working on the wounded with calm professional efficiency. "Pressure on that wound. Someone find my medical kit. Talk to me, Rodriguez. Stay with me." They were airborne, they were alive. Now came the hard part. Getting home through a storm that had only grown worse while she was on the ground. The return flight began as a nightmare and got progressively worse. Ghost Viper, now carrying 8 additional passengers and their equipment, handled like a freight train compared to her nimble inbound performance. The extra weight made every gust of wind a potential disaster, and the wounded Marines in the cargo compartment needed medical attention that Naomi couldn't provide while fighting to keep them airborne. "How bad is it back there?" she called over the intercom as Ghost Viper shuddered through another downdraft. "Rodriguez is critical, possible internal bleeding. Jenkins has lost a lot of blood from that arm wound, but he's stable. The others are walking wounded." Layla's voice was calm despite the chaos. "How's our flight time looking?" Naomi checked her fuel gauge and did quick mental calculations. The extra weight was burning fuel faster than expected, and the storm was forcing her to take a longer route back to avoid the worst of the electromagnetic interference. 40 minutes to base if we push it. Fuel's gonna be tight. Define tight. Landing on fumes. Behind her, she could hear Layla working on Rodriguez, talking him through what was obviously a serious abdominal wound. The medic's voice carried the kind of controlled urgency that meant someone was dying despite her best efforts. 20 minutes out from base, Ghost Viper's port engine began running rough. The acoustic sensors were picking up harmonic vibrations that shouldn't be there. Either battle damage from the canyon firefight or stress fractures from the Pinnacle hover. Either way, it meant they were flying on borrowed time. Naomi, Rodriguez is going into shock. I need to get him to a trauma surgeon within the next 20 minutes, or we're going to lose him. Copy that. Naomi adjusted the fuel mixture and coaxed every bit of performance from Ghost Viper's struggling engines. The helicopter was giving her everything it had, but physics was physics. They were heavy, damaged, and flying through conditions that would challenge a healthy aircraft. The electromagnetic storm began to weaken as they approached the base, allowing her to pick up fragmentary radio transmissions. Most of it was static, but she caught enough to understand that Colonel Rourke had half the base mobilized for her return. Medical teams were standing by, along with security personnel who would undoubtedly place her under arrest the moment Ghost Viper touched down. She didn't care. The only thing that mattered was getting Layla's people to medical care before they died in her cargo compartment. Ghost Viper, this is Tower. Respond immediately. The transmission was clear enough to understand, which meant the storm was finally beginning to dissipate. Naomi keyed her microphone. Tower, Ghost Viper inbound with 8 personnel, 3 critical wounded. Request immediate medical response and priority landing clearance. Ghost Viper, you are ordered to. Tower, I have Marines dying in my aircraft. Save the speeches for later. Clear the runway. Static filled her headset as Ghost Viper's damaged port engine coughed and missed a beat. The helicopter lurched sideways before Naomi could compensate, and she felt the familiar sick sensation of an aircraft on the edge of mechanical failure. Engine trouble? Layla asked from the cargo compartment. Port engines running rough, probably battle damage. Naomi nursed the throttles, trying to squeeze a few more minutes of performance from the failing power plant. How's Rodriguez? Unconscious but breathing. Blood pressure's dropping fast. Through the storm haze ahead, Naomi could see the lights of Fob Meridian appearing and disappearing in the electromagnetic interference. The base looked like a haven of safety after the nightmare of the canyon system, but she knew that landing would bring its own set of problems. Colonel Rourke would demand answers she couldn't give and impose consequences she couldn't avoid. But Rodriguez would live. Jenkins would keep his arm. The other wounded Marines would see their families again. That was worth whatever punishment the military justice system could devise. Ghost Viper, this is Colonel Rourke. You will land immediately and submit to arrest for theft of military property and violation of direct orders. Naomi looked at her fuel gauge, needle hovering just above empty, and made her decision. Colonel, with respect, I'll submit to whatever discipline you deem appropriate after I get these Marines to medical care. Ghost Viper final approach, runway 27. She lined up the helicopter with the runway, fighting crosswinds and a port engine that was now missing beats regularly. The landing lights illuminated a cluster of vehicles surrounding the flight line. Ambulances, security teams, and fire trucks standing by for whatever emergency might develop. Ghost Viper touched down harder than regulation allowed, her landing gear absorbing the impact with metallic groans that suggested the helicopter had given everything it had to give. The port engine seized completely as Naomi shut down the aircraft, throwing up a shower of sparks before going silent. Medical teams rushed toward the helicopter before the rotors had stopped turning. Naomi watched through her side window as stretcher teams loaded Rodriguez and Jenkins, moving with the practiced efficiency of professionals who knew that minutes mattered. Layla supervised the evacuation, her uniform blood-stained but her bearings still straight and professional. As the last of the wounded disappeared into waiting ambulances, Colonel Rourke approached Ghost Viper with a security detail. His face was unreadable in the harsh glare of the runway lights. Naomi shut down the remaining systems and removed her helmet. For the first time in 18 months, she felt like she had accomplished something that mattered. Whatever came next, she had proven to herself that some principles were worth the consequences. She opened the cockpit door and stepped down onto the tarmac, where Colonel Rourke was waiting with handcuffs and a military police escort. But before anyone could speak, Layla Hassan appeared at her shoulder, still wearing her blood-stained flight suit and carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had just stared death in the face and won. "Colonel," Layla said formally, "Captain Vega just saved 8 Marines under conditions that would have grounded any other pilot on this base. If you're planning to arrest her, you'll need to arrest me too for requesting unauthorized assistance." Rourke looked between the two women, one who had stolen a helicopter, the other who had survived impossible odds. Around them, base personnel had gathered to watch the confrontation, their faces reflecting confusion and curiosity about what would happen next. "Captain Vega," Rourke said finally, "you are confined to quarters pending a formal hearing. Sergeant Hassan, you will report for debriefing immediately." As the security detail escorted her away, Naomi caught sight of Torres and Private Kim watching from the communications building. Torres nodded once, a gesture of approval that meant more than any medal. Kim looked stunned but inspired, like someone witnessing history being made. Behind her, Ghost Viper sat cooling on the runway, her rotors still and her engines silent. The helicopter had given everything to bring them home, and now, like her pilot, she awaited judgment for crimes that felt more like heroism. But Rodriguez was alive. That was all that mattered. For 3 days, Naomi sat in her quarters under guard while the base buzzed with rumors and conflicting reports. Through her small window, she could see Ghost Viper on the flight line, surrounded by maintenance crews and investigators documenting every modification she had made to the aircraft. The helicopter looked oddly naked in the harsh desert sunlight, her secrets exposed to official scrutiny. Major Arya Dewan visited twice daily, ostensibly to assess Naomi's mental state but actually to provide updates on the wounded Marines. Rodriguez had survived emergency surgery and was stable. Jenkins would keep his arm, though he'd need months of rehabilitation. The others were recovering steadily, their lives saved by 38 minutes of flying that had violated every regulation in the book. "The medical staff says Rodriguez wouldn't have lasted another hour," Arya reported during her second visit. "The flight surgeon's preliminary report credits your rapid extraction with saving 3 lives." Naomi sat on her regulation bunk, still wearing the same flight suit she'd worn during the mission. She hadn't asked for clean clothes, hadn't requested anything beyond basic necessities. "How's Layla?" "Sergeant Hassan has been debriefed extensively. She's been very vocal about your actions during the rescue." Arya paused, choosing her words carefully. "She's also been equally vocal about the command decision to deny the initial rescue mission." Through the walls, Naomi could hear the daily bustle of base operations continuing, as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. She could feel it in the way guards looked at her, in the respectful nods from enlisted personnel who passed her window, in the whispered conversations that stopped when officers approached. "What's the official position?" Naomi asked. "Officially, you stole military property and violated direct orders during a state of emergency. Colonel Rourke has recommended court-martial proceedings." Arya sat forward in her chair. "Unofficially, half the base thinks you're a hero, and the other half thinks you're a dangerous loose cannon who got lucky. And what do you think?" Arya was quiet for a long moment, studying Naomi's face. "I think you're someone who couldn't live with herself if she'd followed orders, and let those Marines die. The question is whether the military can accept that kind of moral independence from its officers." On the 4th day, Torres appeared at her door with an unusual expression, part excitement, part concern. "You've got visitors," he said simply. Naomi followed him to the conference room, where she found an unexpected assembly waiting for her. Layla Hassan sat at the head of the table, still showing the effects of her ordeal but radiating quiet determination. Beside her sat Rodriguez, pale but alert, his arm in a sling. Jenkins was there too, along with the other Marines from the rescue. "What's this about?" Naomi asked. Layla stood, her bearing formal despite her civilian clothes. "Captain Vega, we wanted to speak with you before the hearing tomorrow, all of us." Rodriguez cleared his throat, wincing slightly from his injuries. "Ma'am, we know what you risked to come get us. We know you didn't have authorization, didn't have backup, didn't have anything, except the balls to do what was right." "Language, Rodriguez," Jenkins muttered, but he was smiling. "What Rodriguez means," Layla continued, is that we've all submitted statements to the investigating board. Every one of us has testified that your actions were not only justified but necessary. You saved 8 Marines who would have died if command had followed standard protocols. Naomi felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. You didn't have to do that. You could have stayed out of it. Like hell we could. This from Corporal Mendez, one of the walking wounded. You flew through conditions that would have killed most pilots, just to pull us out of that canyon. We're not going to let them hang you for being better at your job than anyone expected. Layla placed a folder on the table. We've also prepared a detailed tactical analysis of the rescue operation. Every decision you made, every risk you calculated, every moment of that flight. It's all documented here, with our professional assessment that no other pilot on this base could have accomplished the mission under those conditions. The acoustic navigation alone, Rodriguez added, was something out of a textbook that hasn't been written yet. Torres showed us the flight data. You were flying by echo and instinct through terrain that doesn't exist on any map. Quote, Naomi opened the folder and scanned the first page. It was a meticulous breakdown of the mission timeline, with technical analysis of weather conditions, electromagnetic interference levels, and aircraft performance parameters. But more than that, it was a testament to professional competence from people who understood exactly what she had accomplished. There's something else, Layla said quietly. Word about your mission has spread beyond this base. We've been getting calls from Marine units across the theater. People who've worked with you before, people who remember Afghanistan, they're all saying the same thing. Which is that Captain Naomi Vega is the kind of pilot who brings people home when no one else can. That grounding you was the worst personnel decision this command has made in years. Layla's eyes met hers across the table. That if the military doesn't recognize your value, they're bigger fools than anyone thought. As the Marines filed out, each stopping to shake her hand or offer a word of support, Naomi felt something she hadn't experienced since her court-martial 18 months ago, the possibility of redemption. Not from above, through official forgiveness, but from below, through the respect of people who understood the real cost of leadership. That evening, as she prepared for what would likely be the most important hearing of her career, Naomi stood at her window watching Ghost Viper on the flight line. The helicopter's maintenance was complete, her systems restored and upgraded based on the combat damage assessment. Like her pilot, Ghost Viper was ready for whatever judgment awaited. The hearing convened at 0800 hours in the base conference room, with Colonel Rourke presiding over a panel that included Major Dewan, the base flight surgeon, and 2 officers from Theater Command who had arrived overnight. Naomi entered wearing her dress uniform, her bearing straight and professional, despite the knowledge that her military career hung in the balance. Captain Vega, Colonel Rourke began, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. You stand accused of theft of military property, violation of direct orders, and endangering military personnel through reckless action. How do you plead? Naomi had spent hours preparing for this moment, considering various defenses and justifications. In the end, she chose simplicity. I plead guilty to violating orders, sir. I do not plead guilty to theft or recklessness. But more than that, she had helped prove that moral courage and technical competence could coexist, that following conscience didn't require abandoning discipline, and that the best leaders were often the ones who understood when rules needed to be transcended. Ghost Viper sat ready on the flight line, her rotors still but her potential unlimited. Like her pilot, the helicopter had been written off, then proven essential. Together they had shown that redemption was possible for anyone willing to risk everything for the right reasons. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, and new opportunities to push the boundaries of what military aviation could accomplish. But tonight, Major Naomi Vega stood in the desert silence, finally at peace with the choices that had brought her home. 6 months after the rescue that changed everything, Major Naomi Vega stood in the newly constructed training facility at Forward Operating Base Meridian, watching her latest class of students attempt their first acoustic navigation exercise. The simulator bay hummed with the sound of artificial rotor blades and electronic terrain generators. But what mattered most was happening inside the minds of 12 pilots from 6 different nations as they learned to fly by sound instead of sight. Major, I'm losing the signal, called out Captain Sarah Chen from the Republic of Korea Air Force, her voice tight with concentration as she maneuvered through a simulated canyon system. The acoustic return is too faint to read. Naomi moved to Chen's simulator station, studying the instrument displays that showed a pilot flying blind through hostile terrain with nothing but audio feedback to guide her. What does your instinct tell you about the terrain ahead? That there's something solid coming up fast, but I can't tell if it's a wall or just a rock formation. Trust the harmonics. Drop your collective 2 degrees and listen for the change in rotor echo. Naomi watched as Chen made the adjustment, her hands steady on the controls despite the stress of flying without visual references. There, hear how the sound shifted? That's open air above you. The wall is to your left, not ahead. The simulator registered a successful navigation through the narrow passage, and Chen exhaled shakily as she brought her virtual helicopter to a hover in a safe clearing. How did you know that? 15 years of flying in places where electronics go to die, Naomi replied. But you're learning faster than I did. 6 months ago, that same passage would have taken you 20 minutes instead of 6. The Extreme Weather Response Unit had exceeded everyone's expectations, including Naomi's own. What had begun as a training program for acoustic navigation had evolved into something larger, a comprehensive approach to aviation that emphasized human skill over technological dependence. The program attracted pilots from around the world who wanted to learn techniques that could save lives when conventional methods failed. Lieutenant Colonel Torres entered the training bay carrying a tablet and wearing the expression of someone bearing complicated news. Major, we've got a situation developing. Priority message from Theater Command. Naomi followed him to the briefing room, where a secure video link showed General Walsh speaking from his headquarters in Qatar. Behind him, she could see the controlled chaos of a command center, responding to an emerging crisis. Major Vega, we have a medical emergency in the Tibesti Mountains. A joint archaeological expedition, 12 civilians plus a 4-person military escort, got caught in a flash flood 2 days ago. They're stranded on a plateau with 2 critical casualties and a storm system moving in that's going to shut down all conventional rescue attempts. The tactical display showed a mountainous region in northern Chad, marked with red hazard zones indicating severe weather, electromagnetic interference, and terrain that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. What's the timeline, sir? The storm hits in 18 hours. After that, we're looking at 4 to 6 days before conditions improve enough for normal operations. The casualties won't survive that long. General Walsh leaned forward, his expression grim. This is exactly the kind of scenario your program was designed for. The question is whether you think it's possible. Naomi studied the terrain data, noting the elevation changes, wind patterns, and electromagnetic forecast that would make conventional navigation impossible. It was the kind of mission that 6 months ago would have been declared unfeasible, the kind of mission that had led to her grounding and eventual vindication. Sir, I'll need a full weather analysis and detailed topographical data for the target area, also satellite imagery of the plateau where they're stranded. Already being prepared. Major, I need to ask, are you planning to attempt this yourself? Quote. The question hung in the air for a moment. Naomi looked around the briefing room, noting the presence of Torres, Layla Hassan, and several of her advanced students who had gathered to listen to the developing situation. Sir, that depends on whether this is a training exercise or a real mission. It's a real mission, Major, 12 lives hanging in the balance. Then it's not a one-person operation. We've spent 6 months building a team precisely for situations like this. I recommend a 2-aircraft mission, Ghost Viper as primary with one of our modified Blackhawks as backup. Within 2 hours, the mission planning was complete. Naomi would pilot Ghost Viper with Layla as co-pilot and medical officer. Lieutenant Kim, now one of the most proficient acoustic navigation pilots in the program, would fly the backup aircraft with Captain Chen as his co-pilot. The mission would test everything they had learned about extreme weather flying and prove whether the Vega protocol could be scaled beyond individual heroics to coordinated team operations. The briefing room filled with personnel as the final mission parameters were established. Torres provided detailed analysis of electromagnetic conditions and communication windows. Captain Rodriguez, fully recovered from his canyon injuries and now serving as the unit's tactical coordinator, outlined emergency procedures and fallback options. Major Dewan offered psychological assessments of team readiness and stress management protocols. The target zone is a mesa approximately 2 kilometers long and 800 meters wide, Rodriguez explained, pointing to satellite imagery on the main display. The stranded personnel are sheltered in caves on the eastern face, but the only viable landing zone is on the western edge, a narrow strip barely wide enough for one aircraft. "Weather?" Naomi asked. "Deteriorating rapidly. Winds gusting to 60 knots, electromagnetic interference increasing, and visibility dropping to 0 once the storm front arrives." Torres consulted his tablet. "Launch window opens at 0600 hours. You'll have approximately 4 hours to complete the mission before conditions become impossible." Kim raised his hand tentatively. "Major, given the narrow landing zone, wouldn't it be safer to attempt the mission with just one aircraft?" Naomi considered the question, remembering her own doubts during the canyon rescue 6 months earlier. "Lieutenant, what's the first rule of extreme weather operations?" Quote, "Always have a backup plan. And the second rule? Never assume technology will work when you need it most. That's why we're taking 2 aircraft. If Ghost Viper develops mechanical problems or I make a navigation error, you and Captain Chen will be in position to complete the mission." She met his eyes across the briefing room. "This isn't about proving individual capability anymore. It's about proving that teams can accomplish what individuals cannot." The mission launched at dawn, with both helicopters lifting off into a sky already showing signs of the approaching storm. Naomi felt the familiar surge of connection as Ghost Viper responded to her touch. But this time, the sensation was different. Not the lonely determination of a grounded pilot proving herself, but the confident professionalism of a commander leading a trained team into danger. "Ghost Viper Flight, this is Tower. You are cleared for departure on heading 045. Weather update shows storm front accelerating. Recommend expedited transit to target zone." "Copy, Tower. Ghost Viper Flight departing." Naomi banked northeast toward the mountains, with Kim's Black Hawk maintaining formation 2 kilometers to her left. "Viper 2, how are your systems?" "All green, Viper 1. Acoustic array online and functioning normally." The first hour of flight took them across familiar desert terrain toward the foothills of the Tibesti Mountains. Electromagnetic interference remained minimal, allowing normal radio communication and GPS navigation. But Naomi could see the storm building on the horizon, a wall of dark clouds shot through with lightning that promised to turn the mission into the kind of challenge she had trained her team to handle. "Viper Flight, this is Rescue Control. Latest update from the stranded personnel shows 1 critical casualty deteriorating rapidly. Recommend prioritizing speed over caution." Layla checked her medical supplies and communication with the ground team. "Naomi, they're describing symptoms consistent with internal bleeding and possible spinal injury. We need to get them to trauma surgery within 6 hours or we're going to lose at least 1 person." "Copy that." Viper 2, increase speed to maximum cruise. Weather window is closing faster than anticipated. As they approached the target zone, the storm's effects became increasingly apparent. Radio communications degraded to static-filled fragments, GPS signals flickered in and out of reliability, and visibility dropped as electromagnetic interference played havoc with their instruments. Naomi switched Ghost Viper to acoustic navigation mode, feeling the familiar sensation of flying by echo and instinct rather than electronic guidance. "Viper 1, I'm losing GPS lock," Kim reported from the backup aircraft, switching to acoustic navigation. "Copy, Viper 2. Stay close and follow my lead. We're entering the zone where training becomes reality." The mountains rose around them like the walls of an ancient fortress carved by millennia of wind and water into formations that defied conventional navigation. Naomi guided Ghost Viper through passes barely wide enough for her rotor disc, using acoustic bounce to read terrain features that were invisible in the storm-darkened sky. Behind her, she could hear Kim's aircraft following the same path, his voice calm and professional as he called out navigation checkpoints. "Visual contact with the mesa," Layla announced. 2 o'clock, about 3 kilometers. Through the swirling clouds and electromagnetic haze, Naomi could make out the flat-topped mountain where the expedition was stranded. The plateau looked impossibly small from their current altitude, surrounded by vertical drops that would make any navigation error fatal. Worse, the western landing zone appeared even narrower than the satellite imagery had suggested, perhaps 50 meters of relatively flat ground between scattered boulders and the cliff edge. "Viper 2, hold position at the eastern approach while I assess the landing zone," Naomi transmitted. "Weather's degrading faster than predicted." She brought Ghost Viper into a careful reconnaissance hover, studying the landing area through instruments that registered acoustic return and wind shear rather than visual reference. The plateau was being battered by crosswinds that threatened to slam an unwary helicopter into the cliff face, and loose debris suggested that the surface was unstable. Viper 1, I've got personnel movement at the cave entrance, Kim reported. They know we're here. Naomi made her decision with the same calculated precision she had brought to the canyon rescue. Viper 2, I'm going in for landing. Maintain overwatch and be prepared to assume primary if I have problems. Quote, the approach required every technique she had developed over 15 years of extreme weather flying. Ghost Viper descended through gusting winds and electromagnetic interference, guided by acoustic navigation and the kind of instinctive flying that could not be taught in simulators. At 30 feet above the plateau, a sudden downdraft slammed the helicopter toward the rocky surface, forcing Naomi to pull collective and fight for altitude. Viper 1, you're drifting toward the cliff face, Kim's voice cut through the static. Naomi corrected with cyclic input, bringing Ghost Viper back to centerline as she continued the descent. The landing zone rushed up to meet them, and she felt the familiar sensation of balancing thousands of pounds of aircraft on the edge of disaster. Ghost Viper's wheels touched down with a jarring impact that sent loose rocks scattering, but they were on the ground and intact. Viper 2, Ghost Viper is down safe. Beginning passenger loading. The next 20 minutes tested everything the Extreme Weather Response Unit had learned about coordination under pressure. Layla supervised the loading of casualties while Naomi kept Ghost Viper's engines running and monitored weather conditions that seemed to worsen by the minute. The stranded personnel moved with desperate efficiency, understanding that their rescue window was measured in minutes rather than hours. Last passenger aboard, Layla reported. Critical casualty is stable but needs immediate transport to trauma facilities. Naomi pulled collective and felt Ghost Viper struggle to lift off under maximum gross weight. The helicopter was carrying 14 people plus equipment, well beyond normal safety margins but within the parameters she had calculated for emergency operations. They climbed slowly away from the plateau as the storm reached full intensity, turning the world into a chaos of wind and electromagnetic interference. Viper 1, your return route is blocked by the storm front, Kim transmitted from his overwatch position. Recommend alternate routing through the southern pass. For the next hour, both aircraft fought their way through conditions that would have grounded any conventional rescue attempt. Naomi led the formation through mountain passes using acoustic navigation while Kim provided backup guidance and emergency coordination. The wounded expedition members received medical care from Layla, while conscious passengers helped monitor systems and provide additional eyes for navigation. This is incredible, one of the archaeologists commented during a brief calm period. I've never seen flying like this. It's like you're reading the mountains themselves. That's exactly what we're doing, Layla replied while checking the critical patient's vital signs. Major Vega developed these techniques for situations where normal navigation fails. We've just proven they work for team operations as well as individual missions. The return flight took 3 hours through steadily worsening conditions, but both aircraft reached FOB Meridian safely as the storm reached its peak intensity. Medical teams rushed to receive the casualties while base personnel gathered to witness another successful mission by the unit that had redefined the possible. As Ghost Viper's rotors wound down and the dust settled, Naomi found herself surrounded by her team, the rescued expedition members, and a crowd of base personnel who had watched the mission unfold on radar screens and radio communications. General Walsh appeared on the secure video link from Qatar, his expression showing the kind of approval that meant more than any official commendation. Outstanding work, Major. Your unit has just accomplished something that our best strategic planners said was impossible. The general paused, studying the mission data. I'm authorizing immediate expansion of the EWRU program. We want training facilities at 3 additional bases and exchange programs with allied nations. But for Naomi, the real victory was watching Lieutenant Kim debrief his portion of the mission with the same calm professionalism she had once struggled to maintain under pressure. Captain Chen added her own observations about acoustic navigation in mountainous terrain, while Torres documented technical innovations that had emerged during the operation. The mission had proven that the Vega protocol was more than individual heroics. It was a systematic approach to aviation that could be taught, learned, and applied by teams working together. Later that evening, as the excitement of the successful mission settled into routine post-flight procedures, Naomi found herself in the hangar with Ghost Viper, performing the same careful inspection she had conducted after every significant flight. The helicopter showed signs of stress from the day's operations, but nothing that couldn't be repaired and improved. "Thinking about the next modification?" Layla asked, joining her beside the aircraft. "Always, but also thinking about what we've built here." Naomi gestured toward the training facility, where lights still burned as instructors prepared lesson plans for the expanded program. 6 months ago, I was a grounded pilot stealing a helicopter to prove a point. Now we're training teams to handle missions that don't exist in any manual. What's the difference? Naomi considered the question, looking up at Ghost Viper's rotor blades silhouetted against the desert stars. I think the difference is that individual heroics save individual lives. But systematic competence saves institutions. We're not just proving that impossible missions can be flown. We're proving that military aviation can evolve beyond its current limitations. Major Dewan approached carrying a folder of psychological assessments and training evaluations. The expansion program is going to require significant personnel increases. We're looking at tripling the size of the unit within 18 months. Any concerns about maintaining quality as we scale up? Just the opposite. The mission profiles you've developed are attracting the best pilots from every service branch. Everyone wants to learn what you're teaching. Arya smiled. You've created something that goes beyond technical training. You've created a philosophy of aviation that emphasizes human capability over technological dependence. As the night deepened and the base settled into its routine rhythm, Naomi walked the perimeter of the flight line one final time. The hangar held 6 aircraft now, Ghost Viper and 5 other helicopters modified according to her specifications. Each aircraft represented not just a machine, but a capability that hadn't existed 18 months ago. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, advanced students ready for their final examinations, visiting instructors from allied nations, and mission planning for scenarios that would have been inconceivable before the development of the Vega protocol. The program had grown beyond her wildest expectations, transforming from personal vindication into institutional change. But more than that, it had proven that principled disobedience could become principled leadership when combined with exceptional competence and systematic thinking. The lessons learned during that storm-swept flight to rescue Layla's unit had evolved into training protocols that would save lives for generations to come. In the corner of the hangar, a maintenance crew was painting new nose art on one of the modified Blackhawks. The design showed a helicopter silhouetted against storm clouds, with the motto, "Impossible is just unapproved," painted in bold letters beneath. It was the same phrase that had appeared on the original mural after her vindication, now officially adopted as the unit's informal slogan. Ghost Viper sat ready for the next mission, her systems upgraded, and her capabilities proven in combat and rescue operations that pushed the boundaries of military aviation. Like her pilot, the helicopter had been transformed from cast-off equipment into the foundation of something revolutionary. As Major Naomi Vega secured the hangar and prepared for the night, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The path from grounded pilot to unit commander had been marked by moments of doubt, courage, and the kind of moral clarity that emerges only under extreme pressure. But the real victory wasn't personal, it was institutional. The military had learned to value officers who could think independently while maintaining discipline, who could innovate within the system while respecting its fundamental principles, and who understood that true leadership sometimes required challenging the very authorities that granted leadership positions. Tomorrow's mission briefing would include scenarios that would have been impossible 18 months ago, coordinated team operations in conditions where technology failed, systematic approaches to navigation without electronic support, and training protocols that emphasized human judgment over automated systems. The Extreme Weather Response Unit had become more than a training program. It had become proof that military institutions could evolve and adapt when confronted by individuals willing to risk everything for principles larger than themselves. The desert night was clear and quiet, with stars visible in numbers that were impossible to see from more populated regions. Naomi looked up at the constellations that had guided human navigation for millennia before GPS and radar, understanding that the most advanced technology was still no substitute for the human capacity to adapt, improvise, and overcome. She had learned to fly by those same stars during her classified missions in Afghanistan, using celestial navigation when all electronic systems failed. Now she was teaching a new generation of pilots that ancient skills and modern technology could work together to accomplish the impossible. The hangar lights dimmed automatically as she walked toward her quarters, leaving Ghost Viper and her squadron mates in the comfortable darkness of machines at rest. But even in sleep, they remained ready. Ready for the next emergency that would require flying through the impossible. Ready for the next mission that would prove human courage and competence could overcome any obstacle. Ready to carry on the work that had transformed a grounded pilot's act of defiance into a new philosophy of military aviation. Major Naomi Vega had found her way home not through following orders, but through the courage to disobey them when disobedience served a higher purpose. And in doing so, she had shown an entire institution that the best leaders were often the ones who understood when rules needed to be transcended in service of the principles those rules were meant to protect. The impossible had become routine, but more importantly, routine had been redefined by what was possible when human skill, moral courage, and institutional wisdom worked together toward a common goal. The story of Ghost Viper and her pilot was just beginning. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.